Okay, everybody, welcome back to the online video lecture series for Philosophy 102 Ethics. So in this video, we're going to finish up our discussion of euthanasia, and we're going to do that by exploring a little further one of the concepts that we discussed in our previous video when we were looking at the argument made by Thomas Sullivan, and that concept is the distinction between ordinary and extraordinary means of preserving life. So I want to start out by just reviewing what role this distinction plays in Sullivan's argument. So you'll remember that he says that he takes what he calls the traditional doctrine of euthanasia. And this doctrine says the following, right? So when we're thinking about, is it morally permissible to contribute to the death of a patient? The question for him is the death of the patient, is it intended or is it unintentional? Right? Is the way that we're bringing about that death make it such that what we're trying to achieve is the death of the patient, or are we trying to achieve something else and the death of the patient is a side effect? Now, of course, as we talked about last time, his reasoning here relies on the doctrine of double effect. So if you still need a little refresher on what the doctrine of double effect is, I'd invite you to look at lecture video 10. But here, what I want to draw your attention to is that he says that when we think about passive euthanasia, which can involve withdrawing or withholding treatment in a way that we know will bring about death, that it's possible for passive euthanasia to bring about death intentionally, but also unintentionally. And what that depends on is the kind of treatment we're withholding. If we're withholding an ordinary means of preserving someone's life, then we say that the death of the patient is intentional. But if we're withholding an extraordinary means of preserving someone's life, then we say that the death is unintentional. And remember the way he characterizes this difference. He says, well, ordinary means of preserving a patient's life are all those treatments, medicines, procedures that are not overly costly, not overly inconvenient, and give a very good hope of success. Extraordinary means are just the opposite. They're above and beyond sort of measures, which may be very costly, may be very inconvenient, and even if they work in a technical sense, don't give us a very significant hope of really giving a benefit to the patient. All right, so what I want to look at in this video is how do we distinguish between these two things? Because let's say you buy Sullivan's argument that if you withhold an ordinary means of preserving life, that you must be intending the death of the patient. But if you just withhold an extraordinary means of life, you're not intending the death of the patient, you're just trying to remove a very expensive or inconvenient treatment. So let's say you buy that argument. You might still ask the question, how can we tell whether some means of preserving life is ordinary or extraordinary? And remember, notice the way he explains the difference. He says, well, does the treatment or procedure in question, does it involve excessive pain or other inconvenience? Well, you might think, well, these are somewhat subjective terms, or if not subjective, they're at least up for debate, right? I mean, excessive, well, in comparison to what? Some people might say, well, how much pain, how much difficulty you have to go through to preserve someone's life. The amount that someone would think is excessive could depend on the person. Or how much inconvenience is too much? What do we mean by inconvenience? And when he says extraordinary means of preserving life offer no reasonable hope of achieving a benefit for the patient, well, who's to say what's reasonable? And how do we define what a benefit is? Right? Some people will say the mere prolongation of life itself is a benefit. The longer you live, the better. Some will say, no, what's really important is the quality of life. So the point here is that there are remaining questions that Sullivan doesn't really address when we're trying to determine how do we know whether a means of preserving life is ordinary or extraordinary. Okay, so what's one way that you might go about determining this difference? Well, usually when we're thinking about this, there's sort of two different metrics you might use. There's really two different metrics we're thinking about. So here I have a graph, and on one axis I have the cost of a medical intervention. So I just mean by medical intervention, any procedure or treatment or surgery or whatever that you're thinking about using. And so on this axis, we would be measuring the cost. And by cost, I don't just mean monetary cost in terms of money, but I also mean just in general, all the resources that would need to be used in order to undergo this medical intervention. So we have the cost on one axis. On the other axis, we have what are called QALYs. So it's a little acronym here, and what that acronym stands for is Quality Adjusted Life Year. Okay, so what is a QALY? Well, as explained here, so the core concept of the QALY is grounded in decision science and expected utility theory. And the basic idea is that individuals move through health states over time, and that each health state has a value attached to it. So this isn't something that's too difficult to understand, right? We intuitively understand that as we age, as we get older, our health tends to decline. And so if you consider, for instance, let's say you have a 20-year-old, 1 year of, in normal circumstances, 1 year of being 20 years old is generally seen as being more valuable than 1 year of being 80 years old, right? Because the normal effects of aging will make you less healthy, will make you undergo more pain, more sort of inconvenience, and so an earlier year is more valuable. And so all a QALY is just a way of sort of measuring that. So health, which is what we're seeking to maximize, is defined as the value-weighted time, life years weighted by their quality, accumulated over the relevant time horizon to yield QALYs. So basically the idea is we're thinking about, okay, should we do this procedure, this surgery, this treatment to extend a person's life? Well, we have to ask two questions. First, how much longer do we predict that this person would live? And then what would be the quality of life in each of those years? And to yield QALYs, you use a scale where 0 would be death, and you could also have states worse than death, right? You could have negative values if we're talking about just pain and suffering. And so some of the cases we looked at before, right? The patient with throat cancer example that Rachel's used, if we imagine someone whose remaining life would just be suffering and pain, we might actually give them a quality of life value that's less than 0, just because they're not really getting any value out of their life. They would be getting a negative value at that point. Death would be 0, and then health would be 1. Absolute perfect health would be 1. So you would assign a value to each year, 0.2, 0.4, 0.6, 0.8, whatever you think best represents on that scale the quality of life the person would have. And so when we're making these decisions, and that gives you a value, and you can sort of determine, well, okay, if I think the person's going to live an additional 10 years at this quality of life, is that better than living, let's say, another 2 years at a higher quality of life? And it gives you a way to place a value on that and make that determination. Okay, so first, these are the two metrics that we would consider. And so that gives us, if we look back at our diagram now, that gives us a few different quadrants here, right? So you could imagine, for instance, some treatment or surgery or procedure where the cost is very, very high, and the QALYs, the benefit to the patient, the quality of life years to the patient is very, very low, and that would put you in circle A here. And this would be like a perfect example of an extraordinary means of prolonging the life of a patient. The cost is very high, the benefit is very low, and so this would be exactly the sort of thing that Sullivan is talking about for an extraordinary means. And if you imagine someone, for instance, who we could keep alive for many, many years on life support, that would fall into this category right here, right? So the cost and inconvenience would be high. The benefit in terms of QALYs would be very low, because without any conscious mental states, there would be a low quality of life. And so that would put you right up here in the top left quadrant in circle A. Contrastingly, you could also imagine a surgery or procedure which is in the bottom right. So suppose we had a intervention that we knew would yield a large amount of QALYs, right? So the person would live for a long time, and we'll say they'd have a good quality of life during that period, and the cost was very low. Perfect example of an ordinary means of prolonging the patient's life. If the cost is low, the benefit is high, of course you would want to do it. And the reason I bring this up is because we do have these sort of clear cases, right? And I think Sullivan would say the simple surgery in the infants with Down syndrome case would be an example of an ordinary means of prolonging the patient's life, simply because we know it's a surgery that's effective, it's reliable, and the infant presumably has a long life ahead of it. And so it would fall in this category right here. So Sullivan is going to say, look, if we know something is in one of these two categories, and we know how to classify it, but what if we have a treatment that's in circle B? What if we have a treatment the cost is very high, but the benefit is very high? It's less clear at that point to know whether we should say it's an extraordinary or ordinary means of preserving life. The cost is high, sure, but if the benefit is high, well, then maybe we should see it as ordinary. On the other hand, because the cost is so high, maybe it is an over and a sort of above and beyond measure to preserve life. So the reason I bring this up is because this is where a lot of controversy is going to occur when we're thinking about, is a treatment an extraordinary or ordinary means of prolonging life? All right, so this is all very much in the abstract, but I want to make it a little more concrete by considering the following case. So this is a picture of Robyn Twitchell. And so I'm going to read you through the case of Robyn Twitchell, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. So on a Thursday evening in early April 1986, 2-year-old Robyn Twitchell ate a normal dinner, but experienced severe pain and vomiting shortly afterward. The pain and vomiting continued into Friday, and Robyn's parents, both committed Christian Scientists, consulted several church officials who determined that his pain was in his lower abdomen. After another day of intense pain and vomiting, on Saturday, a Christian Scientist practitioner, Nancy Calkins, came to the Twitchell house to pray for Robyn. Robyn was still unable to hold down food or liquids, and so on Monday a Christian Science nurse was called who also ministered to Robyn. By Tuesday evening, Robyn Twitchell died. An autopsy was conducted and it was determined that Robyn had a bowel obstruction which, in the opinion of one physician, could have been readily corrected by surgery with an almost 100% chance of success. And how this ultimately turned out, the Twitchells were initially convicted for involuntary manslaughter, but their conviction was eventually overturned in 1993 as a result of a legal technicality. Okay, now why do I bring this case up? Well, in this case, we have a medical intervention, namely the surgery that could have cleared up the bowel obstruction. And the question is, so Robyn's parents decided to withhold that treatment, right? And so if we think about that in terms of our scheme here, it's either in this category right here or this one over here. It's either we're withholding an ordinary means of treatment or an extraordinary one. And so the question is, that surgery that could have cleared up the bowel obstruction, was that just an ordinary means of treatment, or was it an extraordinary one? Because that will determine whether the act was morally impermissible or permissible. It will determine whether the patient's death was intended or the patient's death was unintentional. And for Sullivan, that is what matters, whether you're directly aiming and intending at death or not. Okay, so how do we determine that? Well, before we do that, and this is the tricky part, the point I want to make to you is that when we're determining whether a procedure or a surgery is an ordinary or extraordinary means, and we're thinking about the cost of that procedure, if we're not just talking about monetary cost or medical effectiveness, we might also have to think about cost in terms of the patient's values. So notice that his elected elected to forego medical treatment in favor of prayer healing, which didn't work, and he ultimately died from the condition. And this is because of their Christian Science beliefs, so we should probably know a little bit more about these beliefs. So here's some descriptions of the Christian Science beliefs. Since the Christian Science Church was founded over a century ago by Mary Baker Eddy, Christian Scientists have been locked in a struggle with the medical profession. In her book, Science and Health, Eddy argues that mind, not matter, constitutes what's real. Each person should be able to be his or her own physician, and truth will be the universal panacea. The power of prayer was thought to be an antidote to any ailment, since the ailments themselves were really mental in origin. In some cases, Eddy suggested that people may need help in bringing their minds into alignment with capital M, mind. So first, the idea is that all illness is really a mental phenomenon, and it's through the power of prayer they're able to cure any ailment because of this. So that's the broader sort of metaphysical view that is held by Christian scientists. And because of this, you might say, well, okay, even if that's the case, why is it such a big deal if I get medical treatment? It's not going to do any harm. Well, so the harm is the hypocrisy, according to Christian Science doctrine. So children sometimes suffer material discomfort due to the mental beliefs of their parents, who may thus affect their children's health by bringing their own spiritual lives into order through prayer. Such a position does not seem to be at odds with seeking medical care for these children while the parents work on their spiritual well-being. But this is not the case for Mary Baker Eddy, who comments that hypocrisy is fatal to religion. When Christian scientists put their faith in the power of prayer, it is thought that it would be hypocritical also to put their faith in medicine. Some Christian scientists fervently believe that the power of prayer is greatly diminished if the faith of the person praying is so weak that medical help is sought at the same time. Instead, Eddy says it is a grave mistake to suppose that spirit and matter can commune together, and if we trust matter, we distrust spirit. So the great harm, according to the Christian Science doctrine, is in fact that by seeking medical care, you're showing hypocrisy. You're showing a distrust in the power of prayer, a distrust in the power of mind or spirit. Now, of course, you can think whatever you want about these religious beliefs, and that's not really our concern here. Our concern here is that how should we factor in these sorts of religious beliefs, these values, when thinking about the cost of the medical intervention? Because remember, if you have a treatment in category A, where the cost is very high, the benefit is quite low, then this is an extraordinary means of treatment. If you have one where the benefit is high and the cost is low, it's an ordinary means. But it's a much more controversial scenario when the cost is high and the benefit is high, as in Circle C. Now, the first thing is, no one would deny that the qualities from the surgery for Robyn Twitchell would be high. Robyn has the rest of his life to live, presumably. He's a very young child. So we'll say that no matter what, the procedure we're thinking about is either in Circle B or it's in Circle D, because the qualities are definitely high. It's a child with a long life in front of him to live. The question just is in terms of the cost. And this is something I want you to invite you to think more about. Is it the case that, in fact, the cost is low because the surgery is very effective? We know it'll work. It's not super costly or inconvenient, and it promises a great benefit for the patient. Or is it the fact that when we think about the cost of medical intervention, we also have to think about the damage it would do to the values of the parents and of the parents of the patient in this case, or the patients themselves? When we're thinking about the cost of medical intervention, should we take into account the specific beliefs of the patients and the specific beliefs they have about medical practice? Because a Christian scientist might say, well, look, I understand that from your secular point of view, you just look at this as a common surgery which can save the life of my son. But a Christian scientist might say, well, in fact, nothing could go against my values more. Nothing can be a greater harm than showing mistrust and hypocrisy toward my own religion. And if you take that route, then all of a sudden this treatment is in the controversial zone. There's a high cost and a high benefit, and it's not clear whether we should say it's an extraordinary means of prolonging life, something that goes above and beyond, or whether it's an ordinary means. So certainly this is a controversial question, the role that the values of patients should play in medical care. And so I invite you to think about this more on the discussion boards. And so that's all I'll say about this at the moment. I hope that clarified the concept of ordinary and extraordinary means of preserving life a little bit. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in, sorry about that. I'll see you in the next video.